O'Connell is an internationally recognized health and medical writer, consultant, and lecturer on addiction. He has created courses on addiction at Cape Cod Community College and writes the popular Cape Cod Times advice column on addiction. He is also the author of the booklet, Up in Smoke, and the book, Addicted, A Guide to Understanding Addiction. Now, Tom O'Connell.
Hi, welcome to our show, Understanding Addiction. Today we're going to talk a little bit about food addiction. In the 1990s, I believe that food and gambling and relationship addictions are going to come to the forefront, along with our other chemical addictions that we're already familiar with. When I think of addiction, I think that it's a very complicated subject. And I'm thinking of addiction in many ways, not just with chemicals. It's relationships, it's food, it's gambling, it's almost any behavior that we choose to make ourselves feel a little better. And sometimes we go after addictions, or what I call addictive love objects, in order to increase our pleasure. Other times we do it to deal with our pain. And I have what I think is a useful definition that I'd like you to look at now. Addiction is a condition of unhealthy dependence that impairs our ability to function or perform to our full potential. And I think of addiction as a disease. Food addicts are just one of many kind of addicts. When I think of addiction, I think of basically a love object, something that I desire or something I'm devoted to, and whether it's alcohol or food, and I'm going to use this comparison a number of times during this show, because there are strong similarities between what alcoholics do and what food addicts do. Food addicts use food as a reward, as a gift, a source of pleasure, even passion. They use it to comfort themselves. They use it to motivate themselves. They actually have a love affair with their food. It becomes the focal point of their life and a primary relationship. And that's very similar to what alcoholics do with their alcohol. When I was involved with Beach Hill Hospital up in New Hampshire, an addiction treatment facility, they did a lot of interesting studies and seminars to do with alcoholism and also, food addiction. Some of the traits that go with alcoholism are isolation, irritability, anger, a lot of pain, hiding one's supply, and the need to hit bottom before coming to terms with alcoholism. The same basic features apply to food addiction. At Beach Hill Hospital, they found that women who were being treated for alcoholism, when they stopped taking alcohol, food problems began to emerge. And when they got into groups discussing their food problems, they found that a lot of this was traced back to early abuse situations in families. So we find, again, the similarity with alcohol and other addictions. Much of the addiction is related to our early trauma and stuff that haunts us during our lives, and then to escape that pain of awareness about what's going on inside of ourselves, we tend to distract ourselves, and that's why one of the reasons we turn to addictions. Now, what I'd like to do is go through a series of illustrations, and these are the basics of all addiction, and we're going to move through these sort of rapidly. The first one I call the 5 C's of addiction. And the 5 C's are the craving, the compulsion, the losing control, and continuing the behavior in spite of life-damaging consequences, whether it's with alcohol or with food. And the next feature is what I call the D, D, T, and W of addiction. And in this, we defend our behavior. You know, I can handle this. Deny it, we say, well, I don't really eat that much. You know, I'm very moderate, when we're not. Tolerance means that we end up needing more and more of the food or the substance to get the same effect that we're looking for. And withdrawal goes with all of the addictions. When I stop this behavior, I feel all kinds of pain. It could be physical, mental, emotional, social, or spiritual. Another factor that goes with addiction is what I call the CPF of addiction. And this means that it's chronic. It tends to be with us most of the time, even though we may not exhibit the behavior every day or eat the same food products every day. It's progressive, which means that the addiction tends to worsen with time and potentially fatal. How is food addiction potentially fatal? It can affect our self-esteem so much that we will actually think in terms of suicide. Or in other situations, it might lead to passions that lead to things like homicide. And then there's the self-destruction of the body as we get more and more addicted. So we're following the same basic pattern with food addiction that we follow with alcoholism and other addiction. What we're dealing with a lot of the time is feelings. We have mood swings. A food addict typically feels that the world is an unsafe place, but I have my food. I can control that. I can choose it, select it, enjoy it, use it when I want to, be in control. I have my food. I had a friend who was a food addict, self-admitted, and he loved M&Ms. He used to ration them out to himself. He couldn't stop eating them once he started. He also used to sit before a television set, isolated, like the alcoholic with his bottle, with a jar of peanut butter, and literally eat spoonful after spoonful of peanut butter while watching television. What was he doing? He admitted to me he was doing it to deal with his loneliness. He was using it as a substitute for relating to another human being at deep levels. And this brings us to Dr. Gitlow's definition of addiction, which I truly love. It's a disease in which any technique for adapting to the problems of life is used other than interpersonal relating. So what is addiction? According to this definition, it's a substitute for relating, because life is relating. That's what life is. It's relating to ourselves, the internal person, it's relating to other human beings, and it's relating to God or our higher power. An addiction to food and other substances is a substitute for intimacy. And the intimate part of food is incredible. We consume it. It literally becomes us. And so we can see why food can become very addictive. But like alcohol and other drugs, our friend food can turn against us. And when it does, it leads to things like, I'll just read a few from my little list here: heart trouble, stroke, glandular problems, chronic fatigue, depression, malnutrition, high blood pressure, low blood pressure, electrolyte problems, the extremes of being thin and very fat, and the body can't adjust to that very well. So we're talking about effects that are very similar to alcoholism. Emotionally, we're talking about shame, secrecy, the fear of being overwhelmed, impending doom, very similar traits that alcoholics talk about. And there's a high suicide risk for food addicts. Self-esteem problems are very deep. And there are many food addicts who are also addicted to other substances: smoking, gambling, relationships, sexual addiction, the whole range of things. And food is just one of the behaviors. In all of these behaviors, there's one element that we can always find, and I call it the OC of addiction. In the OC of addiction, we're talking about obsession and compulsion. When I'm obsessed by my addiction, I'm haunted by it. I'm preoccupied by thoughts of my love object, whatever it is, a piece of cake, ice cream, pasta, you name it. I'm haunted by this thought. I gear my life to it. I'm thinking about it. I'm anticipating it. I'm loving it. I'm looking forward to the love affair. And the compulsion part of it is when I feel driven. I have to act. I have to eat even though I'm not hungry. And this is the kind of stuff that goes on. A normal eater can leave food behind and not think about it. The addict is haunted by the food, thinking about it constantly. A normal eater can say, no thanks, I've had enough. With the addict, more is better, and more is better, and more is better, and it goes on and on. The difference between addiction and non-addiction really is the slogan, more is better. That's what the addict thinks deeply, more is better. The non-addict, enough is enough, less is better, and health comes with being not addicted. Essentially, what we're talking about with all addictions is relating and relationships. And one of the main goals in recovery from food addiction is to learn to form a new relationship with the way we eat, a new relationship with food. And it's a complicated problem. Questions arise on how do we deal with it if we've been in this situation for a long, long time? How do we develop this relationship? How do we handle our food? How do we change? Not so much just to lose weight, but to get back to the being that we want to be, the human being that we're concerned about and maybe embarrassed about. And to help us do this, in a moment, we're going to have a guest on the show, and that's going to be psychotherapist Geri Olson of Centerpoint Counseling in Harwich. And when we make the transition during the show to our guest, we're going to be watching a graphic about the road to recovery. The road to recovery. The first step, admit the problem. Next, surrender to the reality of the problem. Next, find a way to get some help, and then ultimately learn to change your behavior. To help us understand this process, we have with us today psychotherapist Geri Olson, licensed independent clinical social worker, founder of Centerpoint Counseling in Harwich, Massachusetts. Nice to have you with us today, Geri.
Nice to be here, Tom.
We were talking briefly about food, and it's a complicated subject, and I really just skimmed the surface of it. And you've been in the addiction field for how long?
22 years now.
And you've explored a whole variety of addictions.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And the things people suffer from. And lately you've been doing more work about food, and maybe you could tell us a little bit about that. I know you have a program, an activity called The Missing Woman.
That's right.
And
Mm-hmm.
Food and Feeling.
Right.
Can you explain that briefly?
Yes. I originally got into this whole field of food and feeling after being in general addictions and recovery for some time. That was because no one was really dealing with this issue. And the proven best treatment is group treatment. And so that's what I began to do.
So you've been setting up groups and especially for women.
Yes, right now it is focused mainly with women. However, in the near future, I see that men will be coming into this too.
When people come to you, what kind of problems are they facing that put them in the mode when they really need help and come to you looking for it? What are they faced with at that point?
In terms of
themselves, like what are they feeling? What are they suffering?
Well, in terms of any of the addictions or depression, anything, I suppose, most of the time there's a crisis. And people will call then seeking help. That's the best time to come in, when you're feeling that you're getting ready to admit that there really is a problem.
Is this similar to what the alcoholics call the bottom?
In some cases, although I'm sure there will be people who will hear this show that you're doing today and will hear certain key phrases or identify with feelings that you and I express, and before getting to that point, will seek help. And that's the unideal situation too.
Now, a lot of what food and alcohol and other substances seem to be filling some kind of a need or a craving that we have. And what do you see that traces back to?
Well, I think the feeling itself and the need is a deep, deep sense of loneliness, of being disconnected from something. That's how most people will express it, and they may not know to what or what the loneliness is about. But it's a deep, deep sense of something's missing.
And that's that missing woman that you talked about.
And that is the missing woman, and yes.
Now the missing being, the deep self, somehow is being covered up or ignored or whatever it is, with layers of other stuff?
Exactly, yes. And the other stuff, as you put it, are overlays, introjections, if you will, that other people have laid upon us, so that the real self is quite obscured.
Now, an introjection, is that something that means that something that I take into myself?
Exactly, yes.
And that's like an opinion of myself even? Something like that?
Well, yes, and it has to do with body image, which is something that comes into food and feeling, into the food and feeling group. And of course, this begins with birth. Some people believe, and I'm one of them, that it actually begins in utero. The feelings that the mother has about herself reflect upon the child.
So the mother, well, that's complicated, isn't it?
Yes.
But the fact that it's a good, let's say, a point that we could look at, though. It's when you think about the addictions, we're thinking about a whole being, a whole person, and how they get this way is very mysterious, but it's probably a little bit of genetics and a little bit of environment.
Exactly.
And cravings or appetites and all these different things sort of mixed in. And the process usually involves experimentation, then the thing makes us feel good, we think it does, and then we keep doing it to excess. And so when people come to you, they are excessive in some way.
Yes, excessive in some way, lonely, confused, have a sense that they're not a whole, complete person, that there should be more.
And how have their relationships been functioning prior to therapy?
Well, relationships cannot function in an intimate way until one finds a relationship to the self, so that their relationships would not have been functioning at an optimal level when they come into therapy. And usually that's one of the things that will bring them in.
So when I'm not in healthy relationships with myself and with other people, or with my higher power, and I get uncomfortable, I will tend to go for that thing that makes me feel good.
Exactly.
And that could be what?
Food in this case.
All
of
kinds.
Course. Yeah.
So one of the early things you do is help people to get in touch with what? How does the process work in therapy, recovery?
Well, in the group, The Missing Woman, Food and Feeling, people will typically call and they'll ask for more information, and then they'll come in for a half-an-hour interview. When the group begins, the very first thing that happens is there are 12 women usually in the group, and the very first thing that happens is that with 12 women sitting in a room together with very similar backgrounds, and we find that over and over and over, they identify with one another and with the feelings of one another. So the very first thing they experience in it is a total acceptance in the group. They experience that when they come in for the interview. But then as the group begins, this feeling builds. And for the very first time sometimes in their life, they're in a situation where they're not the Lone Ranger. They're sitting with other people who have the very same issues, and they can identify with that. So the healing begins with the phone call, when someone picks up the phone and can say, you know, I think I need some assistance, I need some help. And then it builds from that point.
So that's the moment of surrender.
Yeah, it is.
I've got a problem, I need some help.
Right.
And then the key is, how do I change my behavior? So they come in and realize that they aren't alone in this. And,
Right.
And then start to share the truth with other people, and listen to the truth from other people, and get in touch with what underlying causes of why I eat too much, for example.
Exactly, and it's not just behaviors, but it's changing behaviors, changing feelings, changing perceptions, and correcting the body image, understanding who they really are and what that body image really is, and not what other people have told them or suggested that it might be.
So the actual goal isn't necessarily to be thin.
Oh, no.
It's to be whatever you should be.
Exactly.
And who knows what that is.
Right. Yes, yes. It's the missing woman. So the exciting part of this is discovering who that person is.
So let's just talk briefly about dieting, and what are the problems with dieting, and why do they fail so often?
Well, dieting doesn't work. It simply doesn't work. It deprives. And what we're talking about in this program is nurturing, filling up.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we're talking about filling that inner emptiness, but not with food.
Right, exactly.
Finding a way to deal with the inner emptiness.
Filling up the missing pieces of the puzzle of who the person is.
So really it's a journey into self.
It is.
And finding out, putting the pieces of the puzzle together. Who am I? Where did I come from? What is my life all about?
Right.
And getting in touch with the various feelings, frustrations, anger. You mentioned prior to the show to me that a lot of women come in with anger and resentment that's there to be dealt with.
Indeed, indeed. A great deal of it.
Now what do I do? When I'm angry, I turn to my food?
And you may not even know you're angry. A lot of this is just compulsive, absent-minded eating.
Yeah.
One of the things we learn to identify is whether we're dealing with an emotional hunger at the moment or a physical hunger at the moment. That would come sort of under the behavioral heading of what goes on within this group, although it is approached as a physical, emotional, and behavioral
I see. Now you also take people through family histories to get them in touch.
Exactly, exactly. And an interesting part of that, we use deep relaxation and guided imagery. Some of the things that occurred were pre-verbal, before the age of 3. that occurred in one's life. And it's very useful to be able to experience oneself as an infant and how you related to your environment. So that's where we begin. And bring it all the way through up to age 20, so that you can get an idea of who you are, separate from the caretakers and separate from your environment.
Now, along this process, there are what we call psychologically stages of development.
Exactly.
And do people either miss those, or does something happen that sidetracks those, or what?
Well, if the first one wasn't completed successfully, birth to 3, then the second stage, 4 to 6, is not going to be a proper fit upon that first stage. And then the stages after that aren't going to fit precisely the way they should.
So when a person becomes addicted along the way somewhere, and it starts early, right?
Yes, it does.
The tendencies to eat certain things and do certain things when you feel sad or lonely. Now, somehow or other, we're being sidetracked from our healthy development.
Exactly.
Now, then therapy, then one of the goals would be to not so much relive one's life, but actually what? Where do you begin anew? How do we describe that?
I think what we talk about then is correcting a false body image, a false sense of self. And we begin then to find out how we really feel about our body, how we feel about it, not how mother or father or a physician or a significant other or whomever, but how we feel about it, and how we feel about our food, and how we feel about the relationship to food. So, as you said earlier, then it's beginning a right relationship with food and with those around us. And the ultimate goal of all of this, I think we could say then, is to develop the capacity for intimacy.
Okay, so then food addiction, like other addictions, becomes a barrier to intimacy.
It precludes intimacy with the self, with others, with a higher power.
Yeah. Now, another thing, to help people through this, I think you told me that you use something like a journaling process or a workbook?
Yes, exactly. The part of the program that is behavioral then would be the workbook. And between the group meetings then, she would work on the workbook. That takes her more deeply into herself when she's away from the group, and then coming back together and sharing with the group. What we find out is that, again, we're very much alike, because what we've journaled is pretty similar.
So we're taking a close look at life.
Yes.
And we're wondering why we are addicted, where it came from, getting in touch with the truth about our addiction.
Right.
And then gradually changing the behavior and facing life in a slightly different way?
Exactly. Changing the behavior, and then the feelings sort of come along with that, because we're behaving differently, but we're also discovering new pieces of ourselves, new parts to relate to. So as you said, it's a very involved process, and yet in a way it's very simple.
And there's no real fixed timetable, is there? Because
No.
we all grow and change at different rates.
Exactly. And different women in the group will grow at different rates. But that's another nice thing about group treatment, is that you're learning from one another as you go. And the group is designed to be presented in 2 parts, in some cases 3 parts, so that the journey goes on.
So the journey will bring us to places like learning to trust ourselves and other people.
Exactly. Oh, yes.
Learning to, and intimacy requires this kind of trust.
It does, and to take risks.
Right.
And the group is a wonderful place to be able to do that.
So I don't want to oversimplify this. I think we're dealing with very hurting human beings
Oh, yes.
who are using food to deal with their emotional pain.
That's right.
And it's not a quick fix.
It's not a quick fix, and one of the things that women often say when they come in is that for most of their lives they've felt invisible.
What do they mean by that?
Well, they mean that they've had no power in the world, that they haven't been seen, they haven't been listened to, and thus there's a very high frustration level leading to anger, leading to eating. invisible.
So, of all things that would make us have very low self-esteem, that would be one of the major things, feeling invisible.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes.
So it's, in a sense, in our addictions, I believe, and it sounds to me that you believe something similar, we're really creating a new person, in a sense.
We're creating the real person.
The real person that might have been covered up, or was covered up, concealed.
Obscured, invisible.
And that can be a shocking process. I mean, very often I think in health we need pain before we find joy. When we have a cut, it hurts. And when it's in surgery, it's painful. But then when we recover from the surgery, it feels great. Is it something similar to that in this kind of recovery?
It is, except the very first thing that a woman gets when she comes into the group is hope, a sense of belonging. And so that's underlying all of this. There's fear, yes, but you know immediately that you're going to make it, that there's hope here, that you belong. And so even though there's fear, even though there's pain, even though it's work, you just, at last, you know you're going to be okay.
Yeah.
And so...
And ultimately, we're running out of time, and that's okay. Ultimately, we get a right relationship with our food.
Exactly, and ourselves.
And ourselves.
Yes, and our higher power, I think we need to say.
Okay, thank you very much
You're welcome.
for helping us understand food addiction better. And thank you for being with us. And come back again for a future show of Understanding Addiction.